Grow CFO is where finance leaders grow together. Join thousands of like-minded professionals using Grow CFO to access the combined knowledge and experience of the finance leader community. You can join us today at growcfo.net. Hello and welcome to the Grow CFO Show. I'm your host, Kevin Appleby, and today I've got with me Andy Cristin. And it's really interesting to find somebody else in the finance community that's written a book. So today, you can find out about Andy and find out all about that book that he's written. So Andy, welcome to the Grow CFO Show.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me on.
So Andy, tell me a little bit about you. What's your background?
So I'm an FCCA. I've never worked in practice. I'm obviously qualified a long time ago with a business called Booker, who you might have heard of, the Booker Prize. Cash and carries. That's it, yeah. Yep. So food distribution. And I got involved in setting up a big business there for a tender that we won, and quite liked that idea. It's quite fun. But it was a bit boring once the business was up and running, so I went looking for something else. Found another very similar business, and I think in total now I've done about 11 startups, which I really enjoy. They're really good fun. Yeah. And also sort of scaled down the size of business that I've worked in. So I had about 10 years in quoted businesses, 10 years in sort of family-run or owner-run businesses, but some quite big. And then for the last 10 years, I'm a fractional CFO or a part-time finance director or whatever we call ourselves these days, working for businesses that are, 10 to 100 employees. And I really like that. I really like being involved in the sharp end, advising people who actually go out and make changes in the afternoon after a conversation in the morning.
Yeah. And, so as a fractional CFO, how many businesses are you dealing with at any one time?
I guess maximum has been about 8. Obviously some involvements are greater than others. Yeah. At the moment, only 5. So, but they're all quite significant. 2 days minimum per month, probably each.
Yeah. So I think it's a really interesting model that's emerging, that there are more and more fractional CFOs, which I think means that startup businesses are getting the right sort of financial help when they need it. Because I think a lot of stuff suffered in the past from really getting too big before they've brought in the appropriate people on the grounds they can't afford them. But
I think that still happens, but
yeah, I'm sure it does.
Yeah. I think I would say definitely I'm brought in later than I should be rather than earlier. I can't think of one where I was brought in earlier than I should have been. Normally, it's at the point where the owner really can't keep up with
you've got to realise
the bookkeeper and no strategy and pricing is perhaps not what it should be.
Yeah. So a fairly decent career as a CFO, then as a fractional CFO. Why write a book?
I don't know why I wrote it. There's a few reasons, I think. It is a marketing piece. There's no getting away from it. It's a way to be one up on the competition. It was great for me to actually think about, okay, so what is it that I do? What is this process that I go through with businesses? Where do I start? Where are we trying to get to? And sort of distill that into a 4-step method. But yeah, it's also, let's say it's a great business card, but it's a great way for people to get to know you without actually taking up a couple of hours of your time. If they don't like you and they don't want to get involved with you, then neither of you have wasted a visit somewhere.
I do a very similar thing with our mentors, realizing that people want to get to know folk before they think about doing business. So I try to make sure I record at least one podcast with every Grow CFO mentor. So at least somebody thinking about mentoring can go and listen to this particular person and get some idea whether there's some chemistry there.
Yeah.
Or they're talking about the right sort of things. I guess the book is a very, very similar idea. So I suppose we should tell the audience what the book's called.
Yes, so it's called The Profit Mindset. The idea of the title, I think, was really because I think a lot of businesses, smaller businesses, are quite focused on revenue. And this sort of second step in the book says, all the revenue is great, but there are different types of revenue probably in your business, and probably not all of it is bringing you a profit. So it's trying to bring the sight of the owner from the top line down to the bottom, and understand which activities are really making them a profit.
So that was step 2, but you said it was a 4-step process. So let's start at the beginning. What's step 1?
Yeah, so in step 1, I like to build a model or something very simple with just a few variables, a few cost drivers, a few revenue drivers, just to sort of typically on a spreadsheet. I'm an accountant, aren't I? So it would
we love spreadsheets.
Absolutely.
Let's face it, we'd probably each much rather be talking to our Excel spreadsheets than talking to each other on a wouldn't we?
I couldn't possibly comment, but just something simple, a simple model. So I was involved in a car transporter business. So a classic number that we always had to understand was the load factor. On average, how many cars are you getting on the back of each load? It's not the only number you need to know, but if you've got, say, 8 numbers that you're really on top of, you're probably covering all of your revenue drivers and most of your cost drivers. And for someone from the outside, but also for the business owner, it's quite eye-opening that, okay, if I then change this bit by a few percent or whatever, what does that do? So, just building a simple model, really. Simple
so it's
P&L.
essentially an economic rather than an accounting model of the business.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I always think economics is sort of a bit more abstract, isn't it? I mean, this is real world stuff. It's
definitely.
It's probably using some of the numbers that people in an industry would understand already. But just trying to put it into a model to be able to build a few scenarios. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I always used to do in all the businesses I had. I had a simple model, even if it was a PLC and you had to have some huge, great spreadsheet that nobody really understood, which you put all of the assumptions in for every week and, and every site and all the rest of it. I'd always come back to a simple model for the whole thing, just to think, okay, does this really look right? Do those ratios look right? And for a small business, they've probably got nothing that this replaces. They probably don't have something just like a mental model, isn't it? It's the basis of a mental model, really, to get straight in your head where you need to be.
Yeah, and my daughter has recently disposed of a coffee shop and bakery. I always had a mental model of that business that simply had 4 or 5 numbers in it. It was kind of, okay, here's the chunk of money that you need to cover your rent and your basic utilities costs. Here's the next chunk of money that you need to cover your staff. Here's the next chunk of money that you need to cover your raw materials and go into all the food you produce. Right. We know roughly what each 3 of those are. Right. Anything else you earn is yours.
Yeah, exactly that. And I used to work for a small chain of cocktail bars. And if I remember rightly, the rent rate, service charge, utilities were about 17%.
Yeah.
Forget the cocktails because they were different, but the food side of it, the raw materials were about 33%. And I think the labour was about 25%.
Yeah.
I can still remember that. So that's the sort of thing.
That makes it really, really straightforward. It's kind of more if you can actually put a number on there that says, fine, that chunk's £10,000, that chunk's £5,000, that chunk's £20,000. Okay, so your revenue now has got to be at least that amount just to cover costs. How much is that a day? How much is that a week? What have you got to be putting through that cash register?
Yeah.
And it brings it all into fairly sharp focus in that very simple way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we mentioned step 2 very briefly. Tell me a bit more about step 2.
So in step 2, generally looking at sort of larger businesses, so something that's maybe got to at least £500,000, probably £1 million turnover, you tend to find that there's been a bit of spread in terms of the type of customer maybe or the services, products that are delivered. And just trying to do a bit of classic sort of accounting really to see if there's three revenue streams in the cocktail bar, for example. They did coffees, they did food, they did beer and wines, and they did cocktails. And the revenue on the cocktail, the profit margin on the cocktails just beat everything else into the ground. What you wanted to do was definitely concentrate on that area. But small businesses don't tend to have the reporting suites or reporting functionality to be able to break things down and realize that. They probably know that they're making a 25% gross profit or whatever it is, depending on where you draw the line. But nobody's aware that it's actually 75% on cocktails and that's covering everything else.
I don't know about small businesses not having the systems. I've worked in a few big businesses that don't have the systems. And I remember one thing that I really cut my teeth in. It must have been, it's 25 years ago now. I was working in ICI in the plastics business. I use this example frequently in the classroom, and I was business accountant for their polypropylene business. So we were making polymer and sending it out to all sorts of end customers. And we must have had 50 or 60 different grades of polypropylene polymer, some more specialist than others. Business suddenly, for supply and demand reasons, went from a £20 million annual profit to a £20 million annual loss. So it was either, the instruction from head office was either you sort this out, guys, or we're closing you down. And when we started looking at which customers and which products actually made money and which didn't, it was astounding the number of loss-making products that we'd had and never really realized it because of all of the product service costs, customer service costs, product development costs. Now you could look at the idea of, well, there's a selling price. Here's what we get for a ton of polypropylene. Here's what the input of propylene gas does going manufacturing process. Oh, look, nice big margin. But then once you say, oh, hang on a minute, we developed this particular grade to go specifically to the molder who's making a little widget to go in the bottom of a can of Guinness. And we spent hours upon hours in the semi-technical plant playing with grade formulations to make sure the thing had the right amount of slip in it. So it stayed shut when the ring pull was down on the can. It burst open and released the gas into the beer when you pulled the ring pull. And we spent all those thousands upon thousands of pounds on that. How much of that product are we ever going to actually sell?
Yeah.
And that it looked on face value like a super fancy, high margin grade of plastic. But when you put the development costs onto it, it was never, ever going to make a profit. And there were just loads of examples of that sort of thing.
Yeah. But at least it wasn't complete loss because I love Guinness. So I'm really glad that you did.
It was a really successful product. But you very soon come to realize that actually, generally speaking, 80% of your profit comes from 20% of your customers.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I mean, that's why I called my company Pareto in the first place, because there's a couple of reasons, but that's definitely one of them. As a sort of fractional CFO, that's what you've got to do. You've got to quickly identify the 20% in everything and try and build on those bits. Yeah, there's a book, a guy called Jonathan Burns wrote a book called Islands of Profit in a Sea of Red Ink, I think it was called.
Yeah.
He did 20 years research into this. He said that across different geographies, different clients, different sectors, different products, however you split your revenue, you've always got this small section that's making all the profit.
Yeah.
And the other bits are just, not even making up the numbers sometimes. They're actually dragging you down.
I think what I learned was that there are two 20% to think about. There's 20% of your customers who are probably generate 80% of your profit. But at the other end, there's probably a different 20% of your customers who are the ones that are dragging all the cost with them, that are constantly complaining, have constantly got issues that you need to resolve, are taking all your sales team's attention and things like that, that you really ought to all the time be looking to bottom slice somehow that 20% of your customer base.
Yeah.
Get rid of it and you'd find life was a whole load better.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's partly what that second step's doing. It's sort of saying that this is the bit you should focus on, but also, and just as you say, that bottom bit, that's where all the problems are. And often it's because the company's trying to do something that it's not really set up for. The clients don't really. It's a bit like the Asian food restaurant that suddenly decides it's going to do burgers as well or something, or a burger restaurant that suddenly decides it's going to do a bit of Asian food. It's always going to be a problem. It's never going to grow very big.
Yeah.
The staff are never going to understand it. The chef's never going to be very good at cooking it because it's not what he does every day.
And
The
generally,
waste will
people
be
aren't going to
awful.
turn up there to buy it because that's not what they're expecting.
No, exactly. Well, no, it might, yeah.
I've got the Rowan Atkinson Indian waiter sketch playing in the back of my mind when the drunk party turn up and one guy, rather than asking for the curry, asks for a McDonald's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those 20% really, really interesting. And I also recall reading a book, and I'm struggling to remember the title, but I'll put it in the show notes. The author is Perry Marshall. And his thing was to take your 20% and then do another Pareto on that 20%.
Yeah, I've seen that done before.
And that was really, really fascinating. That's saying, okay, 20% of your customers produce 80% of your profit. Now let's have a look at the amount of profit that the 20% of the 20% produce, or, in the sort of model that we've got in Grow CFO, where you've got a big freemium model. Now, we always reckon that out of our membership base, 80% would always be free members that haven't paid for anything. 20% would be the paying members. But then there's a 20% of the 20% that will buy your super premium product.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's something in there, I think, about remembering that little group of people are always going to be super fans. And whatever you produce, they're going to buy it. So you've got your £100 product, you've got your £1,000 product. Have you got a £3,000 product for your super fans? Because they'll buy the super deluxe version or the gold plated version or the limited edition version of anything. Yeah. So,
and then so long as it's value for money, absolutely.
Yeah. So step 3.
Step 3, having understood the business and where the profit comes from, is just all about forecasting, really. It's another thing that I think small businesses don't do very well. Don't necessarily see the point unless it's for some sort of financing program, where they've got to put together a forecast for the bank or something. Yeah, I was trying to simplify it and say, you don't have to spend days doing this every year, but if you really understand that model from step 1, just build on that and see what happens if you just increase a few things by 5% each year, if you can do that, or the compounding effect of rate and volume over 3 years can be enormous. But you've also got to think about everything else that's going along. Your offices might not be big enough. Your IT system might fall over. Doing your accounts on a spreadsheet probably isn't going to be feasible. Yeah, just trying to get people to think about growing, because I've seen a lot of businesses get to a certain level and the one person that's in charge gets to a capacity and it can't grow much more. And they sort of try a few things and often they don't do that well and the profit might even go down. It's a question of taking some time out and standing back from the business and thinking, okay, what have I got to do?
Yeah, I think that area of business growth and where you hit the constraints is a fascinating one, because as you say, you can grow fairly successfully until bang, the office is too small, or bang, the IT system doesn't cope with it anymore. Or I suppose a real limiting factor is the one you just mentioned, the business owner that is a business owner as opposed to a CEO. I think there's a big difference between those two roles. A business owner tends to be doing everything or be having everybody report to them, where the CEO will surround themselves with some very good people.
Yeah, quite different outlook.
Better than themselves.
Yeah, that's a lesson I learned. I was involved with a guy who was a serial entrepreneur, and we set up 2 businesses. And right from day one, his thing was to employ people that were better than him in every function.
Yeah, because then you can step away from it.
Well, he never stepped into it. He never really did.
Yeah.
Because he'd done it before, seen how it didn't work. I think the second time he'd done it better. This was the 3rd or the 4th time, and then the 5th, I think. Yeah, he just knew. He needed a really good sales marketing person. He needed a really good operations director. And then he lucked out and got me as the CFO. But, there's 3 people who were specialists in areas that he wasn't. But he brought the whole thing together. Stepped in and out as he needed to, but never really did any day-to-day stuff. Yes. Interesting lesson.
Another thing that you mentioned there was the 5 and 10% improvements and the compounding effect of them. I think that's something really interesting to look at. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I probably first thought about it. There was a government program called Growth Accelerator. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
So there was government money available for people like me and you maybe to sort of, I think we actually did a bit of training, and then we were available to help businesses. And what they were looking for was businesses that were going to double in size over 3 years, I think, which sounds quite a lot when you sort of just sort of say it. But if you think, a lot of businesses aren't pricing as well as they could be, whatever their individual unit price is perhaps not great. So you could move that up and then sort of growing the volume. Whilst you're doing that, if you can improve gross margin a little bit as you would, and perhaps the overheads aren't going to grow too high. Might be certain points where you do need the new office or the new factory if you were manufacturing. I don't really get involved in that. Modelling those sort of improvements for smaller businesses. That's what got me started to think about that. I think it was about 10 years ago, wasn't it? I think that program.
Yeah. And I recall having a guest on my other podcast, The Next 100 Days, which is much more of a business than a finance show. It's an Australian called Pete Williams. He'd written a book called Cadence. And it was one of those, I love this type of business book where rather than just being sort of factual and take you through a methodology, it's a story going on. And the main characters, there was a owner of a bike shop, and he had a client that was coming along to him because he offered training as well. His client was going for an Ironman, so he was coaching. But it turns out the guy going for the Ironman was a bit of a business guru. So the trade-off is that while the training for the Ironman's going on, he's helping the bike shop owner turn his business around. And it's all about those 10% wins. Pete, when he came on the podcast, gave a great example to get your head around of the shoe shop. You've got suspects, the people that kind of look through the window and so on. Then you've got prospects, the people who come in and pick a shoe up and try it on. Then you've got sales, the people who take the shoe to the counter and actually buy it. And his argument was, well, hang on a minute, you've got a conversion rate there, prospects to sales. So what happens if you can increase that conversion rate by 10%? Okay, you've got prospects. Well, what happens if we get 10% more prospects in rather than the suspects just looking through the window? What happens if we can get 10% more suspects? Okay, so, well, there's 3 different 10%. Oh, sale. What happens if we can get them to buy 2 items instead of 1? So the shoe shop example is, would you like a jar of polish to go with that? Yeah. Okay, the next 10%, what about, that's 1 sale we've made. What can we do about increasing the return rate of these existing customers? And he proved that by simply increasing, and in the book, it's all worked out into a lovely model, increasing each of these things by 10%, I think he got about a 60% increase in bottom line. Yeah. And folk do think, oh, double the business. That sounds difficult. Change something by 10%. No, that's relatively easy.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of, there's a scale of ease as well, isn't there? I think it's easy to move people up to a different price point, current customers up to a different price point. Less easy, but in the middle somewhere is getting them to buy more often. Yeah. But actually getting the new clients, that's the more difficult bit, and often, where you have to spend a lot of money on sales and marketing. But that's where people often think that's what they've got to do, whereas starting at the different end is a better strategy.
Well, I don't know about you, via sort of cold email and cold contacts on LinkedIn, I would say 90% of them will come along and say, oh, here's a new lead generation system for you to try out, thinking the only way you're going to grow a business is more leads. Well, actually, I disagree with that. About 7 ways you want to grow your business. I think as a result of all those folk, people put far too much emphasis on lead generation these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's step 3, Andy. Step 4.
So step 3. So at the end of step 3, you've got this lovely plan. And if you leave it in the bottom drawer, it's going to do absolutely nothing for you. So step 4 is to try and make sure that plan's executed. And there's 2 elements to it, really. One is a dashboard of types, monitoring probably half a dozen KPIs, sort of specific areas of the business that you need to keep on top of to achieve that growth. Probably as important, maybe more important, is some sort of mentor, somebody to keep you accountable. Yeah. So most people who are running a business of this size, there is no one they can talk to in the business really, because everybody has an employee mindset. It's not the same, it's not the same thing. So having somebody outside the business that they can talk to, a CFO is ideal, a part-time CFO, but it could also be somebody who would run a business. The guy I mentioned a minute ago, the serial entrepreneur, he'd be ideal because he could help with all parts of the business.
Yeah.
But just someone who understands your plan will help you stay accountable and stick to it, not go off on a tangent. Or if you do, make sure you've gone through the hoops of this is what you need to do. And just so that you know that if it's not going well halfway through the month, you've got that conversation in 2 weeks' time, you've got to do something,
Yes.
What are you going to do to make sure you haven't got a difficult conversation?
I think that accountability thing is a big one.
I think it's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, huge. But I also think that the KPI one is quite vital as well. Some of that, and I'd flip back to that previous thing we were talking about, those little 10% increases. How do you increase something by 10% if you don't know what the number is at the moment?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to have some measurement there.
Yeah. And if you are trying to move something on by 10% during the year, it's less than 1% a month, isn't it? So if you compound it down. So you're not going to know whether you're making it or not just by looking at the big numbers. You need to pull out whatever that is, map it, see what you wanted, and measure it against what you're achieving.
Absolutely. And the small numbers really do matter. I think sometimes as well, you've got to think about, well, okay, that's the number I want to shift. But what drives that number? What drives the thing that drives that number? And go back and say, well, okay, perhaps the absolute result isn't the thing I want to measure. It's something else.
Yeah. So underlying, one of the things that we measure in an architect's practice where I've been working for a long time. I've worked in quite a few architects' practices. It's a model I quite like. It's quite simple in terms of, the work they do isn't simple. I couldn't do that. But the accounting side of it is, and you have the sort of revenue per head is an industry number that people talk about. But of course, like you say, if that goes wrong, you need to understand what's behind it. Well, the two things that are probably behind it are, what's the efficiency? How much work is each individual actually doing, which might come down to hours. I'm not a great one for counting hours, but it might come down to looking at how many hours. But also the price, are you estimating sufficient per job? And if you assumed it was going to take 3 people 2 months to do it, did it take 5 people 6 months to do it? Yeah. Because I've seen a few jobs that did.
Yeah. Thinking of that sort of thing, then the architect model goes to a consultancy practice model.
Exactly. It's exactly the same.
And we always worked on the idea that everybody should be busy, and providing focus support 70 or 80% utilized, and 80% of the time is billed, we'll make a big profit. And we went through a merger, and the reporting wasn't quite right in one half of the business. And suddenly we realized the forecasts we're putting together were massively overstated. And the reason turned out to be that all these folk in the part of the business that had been acquired all seemed busy, all seemed to have clients, but they were all sold out on bits of work that kind of involved a 3-day a week rather than a 5-day a week use to the client. And selling the other 2 days was almost impossible. Somebody in sales thought they'd done a great job selling all these little bits of consultancy, keeping all the team busy. But they hadn't realized in the process of selling all that work that actually what they'd done was building a huge inefficiency into the team of days that couldn't be sold. So measuring some of those leading indicators rather than lagging indicators, I think is vitally important.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the accountability side of it as well. I've been involved having accountability from a few different angles. Coach, mentor, peer accounting. What I was trying to sort of put forward really was a bit like a school governor. Really, I think the idea of the school governor is that you're the critical friend, and that's exactly it. No point in saying, "Oh, well done" all the time. It's more about could you have done better here? How are the new sales in the new geographic region going? If it's something that doesn't get brought up at the beginning of the meeting, probably because it's not going too well.
Yeah, I think the great CFO is the person that's got sort of just that little eye for detail. and can somehow manage to pick out that really awkward question. I've seen some good examples of it. And we had a particular partner like that back in PwC, and you take her a business case, which you thought was watertight. And Caroline just had this knack of spotting the one little detail you hadn't thought through, or you hadn't got quite right, and tear the whole thing apart as a result of it. But it didn't have to keep you on your toes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're trying to second guess all the time, but you'd never do it, will you?
No, never do it. Never do it at all. Yeah. So, process of writing the book, how did you find that?
I found it very interesting, quite time consuming. Obviously, I'm a numbers person, not a word person, really. So I think previously the biggest piece of writing I'd probably done was some sort of essay when I took my exams, sometime in the 80s probably. So it took a bit of time, but I mean, there's a lot of help out there, a lot of books and a few apps. And the thing to do is to just do little and often. I actually dictated most of it onto Word. I found that the easiest way to do it. So I came up with a structure, sort of chapter structure, and points within each chapter. So I sort of mapped it out, a bit like step 3, really, planning, what it is. And then just talked about each bit. And then 50% of that was probably rubbish. So you then change it around a bit and maybe move the order of things. And it does help to get the process straight in your own head, though. I did definitely find that. It's very useful.
Yeah. So how successful has the book been?
Well, I mean, it's not supposed to be a bestseller. The idea is more to give it away than to sell it. Yeah. So I've had some great reviews on Amazon. A couple of them are from people that I know, but not all of them. Yeah, it's quite a sort of a conversation opener to send someone a book and say, if you knew someone had a particular issue with profitability or something, you could send it to them and say, have a read particular chapter 2 or something.
And I did hear a stat a little while ago. I actually went to a book launch a couple of weeks ago from a chap called Michael Heppel, who's just launched a book called Write That Book. So he launched his own book at the keynote event in a book festival, which I thought was a rather clever little ambush at the festival.
Yeah.
But Michael was on stage, and one of the facts that he put across was, well, the average book only sells 200 copies.
Yeah.
So you're never going to you decide to write a book, you're never going to make a fortune. But it is that calling card, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a piece of marketing. I mean, there's a theory that I've heard of that says that if you want to be the go-to person in your industry in this day and age, is it ZMOT? Is it the Google thing? There's got to be sort of 7 hours of your videos or books or whatever around for people to get to know you before they're even going to approach you. So, I mean, it was part of that as well. But yeah, I mean, you say 250 was the most, was it? I mean, that's how many author copies I got originally. So I haven't even sent them all out yet, but they are slowly being sent out.
Yeah.
And then I have to buy a few more. So
I think it depends. What are you going to do with the book? If you've written a piece of fiction, well, are you going to order 200? Possibly not. You're possibly going to do more of a print-on-demand model. If you're using it as an authority piece, well, 200 is probably not a bad number, because you're probably not even interested in selling many of them. You're interested in sending them to potential clients as your calling card.
Yeah, I think there's been more sold actually as Kindle versions.
Yeah.
So in the Kindle versions, I think the prices are something like £10 for the book and £2.50 or something for the Kindle. So it's so easy these days, isn't it? And it's a very short book. I mean, it's deliberately something you could read in one sitting. It's not a big book. So it probably suits Kindle very well.
Actually, I think is a good idea these days. Because one message we've had all the time around building courses in Grow CFO, where you probably think, well, okay, we've got to satisfy people's CPD needs. We've got to make big courses. We've got to make sure they take hours to do. And then people come back to us and say, actually, no, we want things we can do quickly. We don't have time. Time is a precious thing. I actually think the book that doesn't overdo lots of stories and things like that, has a few stories in, because we learn from stories, but doesn't deliberately go and sort of turn 100 pages into 200, is a darn good idea.
I remember reading an Edward de Bono interview, I think he wrote a book called Simplicity, and he said that ideally he'd have written it in under 100 words, that the publisher demanded that it was 200 plus because that was the right size for a business book at that time, which is just bizarre, isn't it?
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. And I'd much rather read the book that's, maybe you can get through in 4 or 5 hours than it takes weeks.
Yeah, and you can still remember the bit at the beginning when you're reading the bit at the end, and it sort of comes together, hopefully. And if you want, if you just have to put some other things out there, then don't you? If somebody wants to read a bit more, you just need to make other things available in specific topics.
Yeah. I suppose the classic example of that book as a marketing aid is why are you and I sitting here this afternoon talking to each other? Because you've written a book.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So the word author, theoretically, someone of authority.
Somebody of authority.
Worth listening to. I'll let your listeners decide whether that's true or not.
So the $1 million question, would you write a second book?
Well, I have actually.
So the leading question.
Yeah, the first book has got this little case study running through it, which was the book startup that I told you about, the MOD tender. That was years and years ago. I was involved in this business with the serial entrepreneur, David, that I mentioned. And it was literally a business that he designed it, we set it up, and we sold it within 5 years, and we got a good multiple. 50 people, there were 2 businesses, but the bigger one was going to got from 0 to 50 people. And it was very profitable as well whilst we had it. So I just thought, there's got to be a story there somewhere. There's got to be, why was that business built so quickly and got to that point? And so I tried to distill it down to sort of four elements. They're not steps, but they're sort of 4 elements, which isn't the whole story, but 4 things that people could actually concentrate on and change to make their businesses more profitable and to grow more quickly. I went through it with him as well. So I have drafted it. It's only about half the size of a book. So I need to add some more material to it, even to make it a small book. But, it's a project that's slightly stalled, but when I get a bit of time, I'll finish that off because I did enjoy it. I enjoyed it more the second time, actually. It was so much easier.
Yes.
Took
kind of
less
know
time.
what you're up against, what you're doing, and so on.
You do, don't you? Yeah. Made less mistakes, I think.
We'll have to have you back on the podcast again when it's published.
Absolutely.
To get on with it, or not get on with it, whichever way you're taking the way this interview's gone.
Always positive.
Absolutely. Andy, thank you for being this week's guest on the Grow CFO Show.
Thank you, Kevin. I've really enjoyed it.